Thank you. So, um, it's like this with every chapter of the Gita, that you read it and you think, oh, this has to be the best chapter. And with chapter 8, you feel the same, that, oh, this has to be the best chapter in the Gita. But one of the qualities of this chapter is that it's very, very much laden with just the feelings of bhakti than philosophy. There is some philosophy in the first few verses, as we will see, but afterwards, this is just the process of bhakti. And we will see how this is indeed the case. Krishna is really telling us how can we get out of this material world and leave our body in a way that we can go back home, back to Godhead. So now I will go to the next one. I want to mention that these slides, they have been composed by Mother Urmila, and I've modified them in certain ways, but I was working on this chapter. I was, preparing for this chapter, and I met with her this week over a call, and she mentioned that she had a very nice chapter, very nice slides on this, and they are very nice, as you will see. So I decided, with her permission, to use them. They're very you'll see the slides themselves are very much laden with her bhakti. So thank you to her for this. So this chapter's title is Attaining the Supreme, and the focus of this chapter is remembering Krishna at the time of death. And we have so many narrations in our scriptures on how devotees remember Krishna at the time of death and how important it is to remember Krishna at the time of death. Here you see the picture of Ajamil and how initially he failed to remember Krishna at the time of death. And therefore great fear was there for him. But then because he said the name of the Lord, then the Vishnudutas came. So many stories in the Bhagavatam are illustrating this very important principle of remembering Krishna at the time of death. And here in the Gita is the philosophy. What exactly is needed to go back home, back to Godhead? What is Krishna's standard? So this chapter actually has a few major sections, and it's very wonderfully laid out. So the first 4 verses are answering Krishna's 8 questions. Then the next part is focused on remembering Krishna at the time of death. Then Yoga Mishra Bhakti. We'll see how Krishna describes, like chapter 6, again, the process of yoga mixed with bhakti. Then pure devotional service. Krishna talks about how pure devotional service leads to remembering Krishna at the time of death, which leads to the spiritual world. And then in the next section, Krishna compares the material and spiritual worlds. Why should we want to go to the spiritual world? In what ways is the spiritual world different than the material world? Krishna tells us that in detail. And then finally, in the last section, Krishna, again, like every chapter, shows the supremacy of pure devotion, pure devotional service in attaining Krishna. So these are the various sections of this chapter, and we will be going through this section by section, trying to comprehend this chapter. And this chapter is very logically organized. It's very nicely, very wonderfully organized. So it just flows from one point to another, to one point to another. And Krishna is telling us both through yoga and also through devotion how we can remember Krishna at the time of death. What the yogis do to go to the spiritual world. So as I mentioned to you that this chapter is very much focused on remembering Krishna at the time of death and attaining the supreme, which is the focus of chapter 8. And therefore, this chapter is very much focused on Abhideya. So how to practice Krishna consciousness so that we can attain the prayojana, which is attain Krishna after our death, at the time of death. So there's three stages in our devotion. Sambandha is knowledge, which is what one contemplates in this life, one remembers at death. So Krishna talks about how to make this sambandha, you must have knowledge of Krishna and you must contemplate that knowledge. And this is what we're doing right now. And then once you gain that knowledge, you have to meditate on Krishna and serve Krishna. And when we do this, then we can attain Krishna. And then prayojana is attaining Krishna beyond the material world. Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. All three are present in this chapter, and particularly this chapter is focusing on Abhideya. Krishna describes what is our relationship with him, what is the process to reach him, and what is the spiritual world. So in the last chapter, Krishna ended the final verse of chapter 7. Krishna ends by telling Arjuna to remember him at the time of death. And so therefore, at the beginning of this chapter, Arjuna, again being such a good student, he says, well, Krishna, you told me to remember you at the time of death. And I am at the brink of death. I'm standing here on the battlefield with arms in my hands, with the arms meaning the weapons in my arms. And I have all my relatives on the other side. I need to fight. So how can I remember you at the time of death on this battlefield? I mean, if someone has a peaceful situation, they're in Vrindavan Dham, or they're a great yogi in the forest, for them it would be easier to remember Krishna at the time of death. But Arjuna, he'll have an enemy in front of him. He'll be sword in sword, arrow to arrow with someone else. How in that intense situation can one remember Krishna at the time of death? And his question is so relevant for us because most of us know that most of us will not have the privilege or the luxury of giving up our body in Vrindavan Dham and knowing when we will die. We may find ourselves in any situation when death approaches us. So how can we remember Krishna and at the time of death so that we can reach him? He makes it very clear that we need to do that. So we are very much in Arjuna's situation, and Arjuna's question is very relevant to us. And before he asks that question, he asks Krishna 7 other questions, which Krishna answers within just a few verses. And then he spends the rest of the chapter answering this last question of Arjuna, showing how important that question is and how really that's the only very important question that we have. So there's an acronym for this chapter that is dead. This is in this chapter, Krishna deals with the subject of death. And so therefore, the acronym is dead. We will see in our next slide. How to prepare for it, what happens at the fateful moment, and what lies beyond. It's a full manual. And those of us, who are on this call, who are, young in age, we might think that this is more relevant to, those above 80. But no, death can approach us at any time. Death can approach us at any moment. And an 80-year-old man may be younger to us than, maybe younger than a 30-year-old man. Because the 80-year-old man may live another 20 years, but the 30-year-old man may only live another 5 years. So therefore, this knowledge is relevant for everyone. It is a sign of sanity and wisdom if one takes time to contemplate their death. Nobody wants to face it, but everyone has to face it. Therefore, Socrates, he said very famously, an unexamined life is not worth living. An unexamined life is not worth living. Because unless we examine what is death, what is life, then what is the purpose of this life? It's like a passing dream. And preparation means that we think about it beforehand. It's actually very interesting. In Buddhism, also, they have this idea. Buddhism is a very ascetic tradition. So for them, it's even more important. They don't have the process of bhakti. And many of them are monks. So they have this principle, which is called dying before dying, or dying before death. Meaning that when they become a monk, they tell themselves that I have died, and or I'm dying, and if, let's say, it's a mind game actually. If you imagine that you're going to die tomorrow, right? Let's just hypothetically think that if I'm going to die tomorrow, then what would I do today? What do you all think? If we were going to die tomorrow, then today, would I go and would I go and clean my room and make nice gulab jamuns and make a nice pizza? No. If I was dying tomorrow, then what would I do today? Well, I would say goodbye to a few people. I would want to say goodbye, but I think the rest of the day I would spend chanting, and I would chant very, very intensely throughout the day and throughout the night in preparation for the next day. Now, if you stay in that consciousness that this is actually quite possible, that any day can be my last day, and so therefore I will die before dying. In other words, I will prepare for the death in the way that I'm about to die. Then I would lead my life in complete devotion. And that is the ideal life. So that is the life, especially of the monk, the Buddhist monk. So they train their minds. It's one of their practices to live like this. They train their mind that, well, so many people do die. And Maharaj Yudhishthira says that the most amazing thing in this world is that although everyone dies, no one thinks they will die. But we know so many people will die tomorrow. With the COVID, this has become even more obvious. It was always there, but now it's in the news every day. Tomorrow, 4,000 people will die from COVID. Well, there's another 20,000 people who are dying due to another reason, and another 20,000 people who are dying for another reason. They say, I think, like every 1 minute, someone dies from a car crash. So we think COVID is so bad, but there's no legislation in place to try to avoid people from crashing their cars. That's okay, but COVID is not okay. I mean, just see how unresponsible the government is. Every moment, someone is dying from a car crash, yet it's okay. But COVID, big problem. It is a big problem, but why not also the other things? But anyway, so someone else, 20,000 people are going to die for something else, for something. So it's not unlikely that a person dies. And so if we have that consciousness, that awareness, then we will know, well, it's a possibility that I could also die any day. And therefore, I should lead my life in that way. And therefore, Madhava Prabhu, when he does his kirtan, he oftentimes says, right, chant in the way as though this is your last breath. Chant each mantra in a way that this is your last breath. If that is the case, then how intensely would you chant? And I'm saying this for myself. That's why I'm saying it with so much passion, that we must always keep that in mind, that there's always a life is on the brink of the Bhagavatam describes that this life is like a man who is hanging from a tree with his fingertips, and below him is a big canyon. Above him is a snake that's on the tree about to bite him. And and the branch that he's hanging from is about to break. Yet there's a few drops of honey coming from that hive on that tree. And the man thinks, my life is very good. This honey is very sweet. So preparing for death is the message of this chapter. So the acronym here is that for each sections is doubts. The first 4 verses, Arjuna expresses his doubts. Text 5 to 8, Krishna explains how to end one's life. What is the way to go back home, back to Godhead? In the next section, Krishna further explains how to prepare one's life to attain the Supreme. And the final verses focus on devotion to Krishna, and how devotion is the most effective way of reaching Krishna. By remembering Lord Krishna in devotion throughout one's life, and especially at the time of death, one can attain to his supreme abode beyond the material world. And Krishna specifically, I'm a little going ahead here, but Krishna specifically makes a point in this chapter that unless you practice during your life, you cannot remember Krishna at the time of death. And therefore the philosophy that, I'm still so young, let me remember Krishna towards the end of my life, that is the incorrect philosophy, because we will not be successful unless we start early in our life. Thinking that I can offer my life to Krishna at the end is like thinking that you have a nice flower, right? We have a very beautiful flower, and someone takes a flower and offers it to Krishna. But another person takes that flower and they let it sit in the sun, for a few hours. Then they take that flower and they crunch it under their feet. And then they, take the flower and, put some, some dust on it. And then after that, they take that crunched up old flower and they offer it to Krishna. They say, here, Krishna, take this flower. So that is like if we think that, when I'm young and strong, I will enjoy. But once I get old, then I will offer my life to Krishna. Yes, after we've used the energy of the body, then what is left, I offer to Krishna. So that's like offering the old crunched up flower to Krishna. We should not do that intentionally. Of course, if we join late in Krishna consciousness, we should offer whatever we have to Krishna. But Prahlad Maharaj says, Kaumaram acharit pragya. Spiritual life must be practiced from the beginning of life. So these 4 questions. How does Arjuna begin? First question is, what is Brahman? So he's almost doing a review for us. What is Brahman? And Krishna's answer is, Brahman, here in this context, refers to the indestructible living entity. We are all Brahman. Krishna is Brahman. Anything spirit is Brahman. The second question Arjuna asks, what is Adhyatma? To this, Krishna responds, the living entity's nature, which is to serve. That is Adhyatma. The intrinsic nature of a living entity. What is karma? Karma is action pertaining to the development of the material bodies. So this is our activities. Karma literally means action. So just expanding on these things, what is Brahman? The Lord explains karma, fruit of activities, devotional service and yoga principles, and devotional service in its pure form. The Srimad Bhagavatam explains that the supreme absolute truth is known as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. Arjuna addresses the Lord as Madhusudana because Krishna once killed a demon named Madhu. Actually, these questions, which are of the nature of doubts, should not have arisen in the mind of Arjuna, because Arjuna is a Krishna conscious devotee. Therefore, these doubts are like demons. Since Krishna is so expert in killing demons, Arjuna here addresses him as Madhusudana, so that Krishna might kill the demoniac doubts arisen in Arjuna's mind. So Arjuna has these 8 questions, these 8 doubts, and Krishna is answering them. But Arjuna knows that he should not have had these doubts, these questions. Krishna has already explained 7 chapters. But he's saying, Krishna, you are Madhusudana. You killed the Madhu demon at the beginning of creation. And so therefore, kindly destroy my demon-like doubts. So when we have doubts, as we read in the last chapter, it is sometimes a result of sinful activities or sinful desires. So Arjuna is thinking in this way, that my doubts are demoniac, and Krishna, please destroy them. So Prabhupada, in the purport to text 2, also he writes, Maharaj Kulashekar, a great devotee, prays, My dear Lord, just now I am quite healthy, and it is better that I die immediately, so that the swan of my mind can seek entrance at the stem of your lotus feet. So, better not to wait until our voice is choked up with cough and our mind is not clear. Better to leave our body when our mind is very clear and our intelligence is fixed on Krishna. So in this second verse, Prabhupada, these are some quotes from the second verse. Prabhupada is telling some very interesting points. And Prabhupada is saying that how Krishna is now gradually going to destroy these doubts that have arisen in Arjuna's mind. The Chandogya Upanishad describes the Vedic sacrificial process. On the sacrificial altar, 5 kinds of offerings are made into 5 kinds of fire. The 5 kinds of fire are conceived of as the heavenly planets, the clouds, the earth, man and woman, and the 5 kinds of sacrificial offerings are faith, the enjoyer on the moon, rain, grains, and semen. In the process of sacrifice, the living entity makes specific sacrifices to attain specific heavenly planets, and consequently reaches them. When the merit of sacrifice is exhausted, the living entity descends to earth in the form of rain, then takes on the form of grains, and the grains are eaten by man and transformed into semen, which impregnates a woman, and thus the living entity once again attains the human form to perform sacrifice and so repeat the same cycle. In this way, the living entity perpetually comes and goes on the material path. So here, Prabhupada is describing the answer to Arjuna's first question, which is, what is Adhyatma? What is the living entity? And what is Brahman? So he's saying that this living entity, how is it that this living entity comes back into in this material world? Prabhupada gives the cycle. He says that actually the way that the living entity is conceived and takes birth in this world is actually through rain. It's very interesting. The souls are present in the droplets of rain, and that rain falls on this earth, and then it forms into many vegetables and fruits. And those vegetables and fruits are then cooked into food. That food is eaten by the man, and then the man impregnates the woman. And from that, the child is born. So this is the process of how the living entity actually enters into the womb of the mother and then takes birth. So
Prabhuji, I have a question, Prabhuji. Prabhuji, so even women, they eat grains. So what happens to that jivas?
uh, so that's not all grains have, you could say, jivas that are meant to take birth. And the jiva is there in so many different places, but it can only, you could say, materialize through a specific process. So it has to, be developed first in the semen of the man, and then it has to then further be developed in the womb of the mother. So the souls are everywhere. Souls are present in plant forms also, animal forms also, but the soul can only manifest through a specific process. And this is the process by which the soul gets manifest. So
Uh, Sorry, Prabhuji, follow up with this. So only a human being can be born from that jiva. I mean, from that man, the brain. But how do the animals are born then? When the animals eat it, the male animals eat it.
that's because they have an animal. Yes. So they also have the male
Sorry,
animal and male.
sorry, Prabhuji, your voice broke. Maybe my internet is wrong, not good. So it can happen through a male human being or a animal male.
Anyone. So
Okay.
in other words, the soul is the same, right? So the soul is in the grain. Now, according to the mother and father, that soul will take a particular body. So in the case of a animal, the mother and father are animals, and so therefore they will take uh, those souls will take an animal body.
Okay.
But in the case of the human being will also eat it, and some souls, as I mentioned, it's not that all souls will take birth from that specific process. A certain soul whose karma, which is a third one here, whose karma is um, making it so that they take birth from that mother and father, will take birth from that mother and father. Yes.
Okay, Prabhuji. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, because someone may wonder that, how is it that the soul goes into the man's body and then is the mother's impregnated? It is through the grains, and the grains come through rains, and Krishna puts the soul in the rain. Yes. Brandy, I think you had a question.
Yes, Hare Krishna Prabhuji, thank you. I'll go to Srila Prabhupada. Please accept my humble obeisances. Mataji's question actually reminded me of a question that I was just speaking about yesterday. I learned that in the spiritual world, so nothing diminishes. And there's the example of burfi, like Krishna eating burfi. What I if nothing diminishes, does the soul, like in that burfi, that jiva that's serving Krishna in that way, does it just stay there forever, or do they like bounce around, or how do I make sense of this, or can we just not conceive it because it's the spiritual realm?
That's a very good question. That's a very nice question. See, in the spiritual world, no one is taking birth because the spiritual world is eternal. So therefore, this process here is described about the material world. In the spiritual world, everyone is eternal. Now, but that's still a good question, because I thought about this before, that if everything in the spiritual is living and everything is personal, then that means the rasagulla that Krishna is eating or the coward boys are eating are also persons. And then, if they eat them, then how do they digest them? And what happens to the rasgulla after they've eaten it? Because you don't think that in the spiritual world people would be evacuating also, they don't need to use the bathroom there. So there's some special dynamic there in the spiritual world about eating prasadam that I'm not aware of.
Uh,
I,
Prabhuji,
yeah.
can I share this Rasgulla example Radhanath Maharaj gives, and I was transcribing that class.
Okay.
And Maharaj said the Rasgulla, Krishna looks at the Rasgulla, and the Rasgulla goes dancing in Krishna's mouth. And then he chews on it, and the Rasgulla feels immense happiness and pleasure because Krishna is chewing on him. And then the Rasgulla gets, you know, uh, the transformation happens, like the shape and all changes, but again the rasgulla gets back to, it transforms into another rasgulla. So
Ah.
it does not get digest, it does not go down, it just has pleasure with Krishna, and it comes back again to another form of a rasgulla. So this, I can send you that class. It's amazing. All he told about everything. How Dhoti is so happy and feeling so much pleasure that Krishna is wearing me. So
Yes,
I will share that class with you.
well, see, he has an insider point of view. So someone who actually knows the spiritual world will actually be able to describe it. And thank you for mentioning that. Maharaj is in the spiritual world, so he knows exactly how this is working out. And see, the dhoti, I'd heard that the dhoti is so pleased when Krishna chooses that dhoti and wears it. Also, the flowers the same way, they become so delighted when Krishna goes to them and smells them. But this point of food, I didn't know. And it makes so much sense that Krishna chews on it. And then, he probably just mystically becomes another Rasgulla and continues his service being a Rasgulla for Krishna. You could just imagine how much fun that would be to be chewed by Krishna. Uh,
Hare Krishna Prabhu, I just have one quick point
yes.
to make. Like this lecture I heard long back
Mm,
on the Brahma Samhita,
mm,
and the person who gave the lecture told that everything, all the things that we see in the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, for example, like Rasgulla or actual Goloka Vrindavan, the trees in there, maybe not the trees, but the roads or benches like dhoti,
mm.
flutes, everything. These are all like Lord Balram's amsas and not probably jivas. So that is what something I heard. Like they're all
Yes.
everything in Goloka Vrindavana. The things are Lord Balram's amsas, and Lord Balram takes care of all the things that give Krishna pleasure. So that is one thing that I heard in one lecture.
I see. Wow. Yes. So, well, that's now you bring another very interesting point that everything is personified in the spiritual world, and different living entities take different forms. But also, like you're saying, it's said that Balaram takes the form of all of these things. So, therefore, it is like, for example, Krishna's seat, particularly like you mentioned, it's described that that is Balaram, and that's Balaram's energy becoming that, and it's not exactly a living entity who takes the form of Krishna's seed. So it could be, I think what you're getting at is that the Rasagulla is the spiritual energy of Balaram, and maybe is not, a eternal,
A jiva.
yeah, jiva eternally in the form of a Rasgulla.
Yes,
But
that's what I heard from the lecture. Like Krishna's dhotis, like everything, vastra, flowers, these are all Lord Balram's amsas. Anything that is not a jiva, like the things that we consider as like non-living things, so things basically, they're all Lord Balram's amsas. That's what I heard in that lecture.
yes, at the same time, Prabhu, the only thing is that at the same time, like uh, there's also the Shantaras in the spiritual world, and that Shantaras is this neutral ras, which is, for example, the stones of Vrindavan. It's
Mhm.
described that one can become a stone in Vrindavan. For example, Bhakti Tirtha Swami, he was before leaving this world, he was praying that let me become a stone in Vrindavan. And um, of course, part of this was his mood of humility, but part of this was also because it is factual that the devotee can become a stone in Vrindavan. And for us, that seems very boring. It's like, who would want to be a Rasgulla for the rest of your life? Who would like to be a stone for the rest of eternity? But that's because we don't know that spiritual world. We just don't have the understanding of how we're thinking of the spiritual world in terms of an anthropomorphic idea, an idea that everything has to be like human beings, and that's the only way it's fun. But in the form of a rasgulla, there could be thousands of rasas that are exchanged amongst the devotees and Krishna. And so I would say it could be both ways. It could be an ansha Balaram, and it could also be that certain souls take the form of stones or dhotis or rasgullas.
Yes, that's really a good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, like for example, flowers are definitely, I've read, in Vrindavan Mahimamrita, where Prabodhananda saw, he definitely speaks of flowers as souls. That this flower was saying to Krishna, or this flower was expressing their happiness. And so, yeah, it could be both, like you're saying. Thank you. So we
Hare
covered.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, Pranam, all good Srila Prabhupada and Gurudev. Please accept my humble obeisances. Prabhu, does all raindrops have the souls, jivas, or is it mixed?
I mean, my understanding, maybe the purport, Prabhupada did specify it. Yeah, he just says the living entities descend to earth in the form of rain that then takes on the form of grains, and grains are eaten by man and transformed into semen. So I don't see that where he says that every raindrop has a soul in it. And so, I mean, in some places he does say that jivas are all pervading. And what he specifies there, Prabhupada says, all pervading means that jivas are present everywhere. In every atom, there's a jiva. The souls are present in every place in this world. So most likely there's a soul in every atom. So even in every, drop. But not all those souls actually manifest into human beings. These things are pretty much beyond our understanding, but Krishna is just giving us an understanding on how to understand these. So in the first three we had here, Krishna talked about what is Brahman, what is Adhyatma, and what is Karma. So these three things he's answered. And he answers very briefly. So in other words, there's also not so much to say or explain on these things. Like, for example, Adhyatma, personally, I would like more explanation on this myself. Because Brahman is a living entity, so Adhyatma is the nature. But in the translation, Krishna says his eternal nature is called Adhyatma, the self. So the indestructible transcendental living entity is called Brahman, and his eternal nature is called Adhyatma, the self. So nature is the self. And so that was my daughter saying that I'm attending the seminar. So this is so Krishna here is saying that the eternal nature is called Adhyatma, the self. And then Prabhupada is sort of explaining in the purport that this means that we are meant to serve Krishna, and we have service, our nature is to serve Krishna, and then karma is being described. After this, we have now the fourth question is Adhibhuta. What is Adhibhuta? Arjuna is asking, and that is the ever-changing material nature. And this we find in the Bhagavatam, mentioned in many places. And you'll start to recognize this. Adhibhuta, and then there's Adhidaiva. What is the Adhidaiva? The Adhidaiva is the universal form of the Lord, which includes all the demigods. So generally referring to the demigods. Adhibhuta, material nature, Adhidaiva, the demigods. And what is Adhiyagya? That is the Supreme Lord, who is the Lord of all sacrifices. Adhyatma, Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhiyagya. Where does Adhiyagya, Krishna, reside? And the answer to that is within everyone's heart. So here are the first 7 questions. Arjuna just wants a rundown of this, and Krishna gives him step by step, one answer by another answer. Now, the 8th question, Krishna spends the rest of the chapter. He spends the rest of the chapter discussing this. So this word adhi means above, over, and beyond. So Krishna is asking about all of these things that are above and beyond. So, what is Adibhuta? That is things that are beyond us. That's the physical manifestation. What are the things that are controlling us? That's the demigods. And the ultimate Adi, the person beyond us, is Adi Yagya, the Lord, who is residing in our heart. Prabhupada says in text 4, material bodies generally pass through 6 stages. They are born, they grow, they remain for some duration, they produce some byproducts, they dwindle, and then they vanish. This physical nature is called Adibhuta. So material nature works in this way. The material nature is like a vessel, and it carries the soul from one place to another. Now, this final question, how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So this becomes the main topic of this chapter. Krishna answers this in text 5 and 6. And whoever at the end of his life, remembering me alone, at once attains my nature, of this there is no doubt. So I'm going to share this verse because I want to read this verse. This is most important here. Antakale ch mameva smaran muktva kalevaram yaprayati samadbhavam yati nastatra sanshaya. And whoever at the end of life quits his body, remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this there is no doubt. So Krishna's general point here is that whoever remembers him, remembers his nature at the time of death, attains his nature. So whoever remembers his nature attains his nature, which is a point Krishna makes later on in the next few verses, that whatever nature you think of, to that nature you attain. And I'll read the purport because this purport is very, very nice. In this verse, the importance of Krishna consciousness is stressed. Anyone who quits his body in Krishna consciousness is at once transferred to the transcendental nature of the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord is the purest of the pure. Therefore, anyone who is constantly Krishna conscious is also the purest of the pure. The word smaran, remembering, is important. Remembrance of Krishna is not possible for the impure soul who has not practiced Krishna consciousness in devotional service. Therefore, one should practice Krishna consciousness from the very beginning of life, as I was mentioning before, Komaram Acharit Pragya. If one wants to achieve success at the end of life, the process of remembering Krishna is essential. Therefore, one should constantly, incessantly chant the Mahamantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Lord Chaitanya has advised that one be as tolerant as a tree, taror api sahishnuna. There may be so many impediments for a person who is chanting Hare Krishna. Nonetheless, tolerating all these impediments, one should continue to chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So at the end of one's life, one can have the full benefit of Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada here has twice repeated the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. Twice Srila Prabhupada has said that the only way to attain success at the end of one's life is to take the holy name of Krishna. And it's very interesting, and we have a few slides on this, you'll see. It's very interesting that in this chapter, and when you read the purport, you'll see, Prabhupada again and again repeats the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. In no other chapter does he repeat it so often. But in this chapter, he just, it's like, we just read this, but he repeats it again. Only by chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, only by chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. This shows that the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra is the way to go back home, back to Godhead. Without that, we cannot remember Krishna at the time of death. And here, Prabhupada is saying and giving a very, very deep message. He's saying, in order to do that, one has to be as tolerant as a tree. In order to go back home, back to God, one has to chant Hare Krishna. But in order to chant Hare Krishna, one has to be as tolerant as a tree. Tarorapi sahishuna. Otherwise, unless one is as tolerant as a tree, one will not be able to continue chanting. Because Krishna will put such immense difficulties on our path when we chant, that unless we're as tolerant as a tree, we will not be able to continue chanting. And that is a fact. We can see in our life, in everyone's life, that to chant is so easy, but actually it's not easy. Because Maya will put every obstacle on our path to discourage us from chanting. Bad relationships, a bad experience, too much work, anxieties, problems. And so therefore, unless we are like a tree and tolerant like a tree, we will not be able to reach the goal. We won't be able to chant. We'll have to put everything else aside. Like people many times they say, and all of you are preachers, so you know this very well, that people say, I have no time to chant. Unfortunately, I'm just so busy, I have no time. But we have to understand that that is the very test that we have to overcome. The very problem is that we don't have time. And so that's not an excuse, that is the very problem to be overcome. One has to take out time, which means being as tolerant as a tree. One has to give up other things to make time, make room for chanting. So very instructive verse, very deep verse, and one of the most famous verses of the Gita, where Krishna is promising us that if we remember him at the end of life, we will reach him. And this is the test. So everything we're doing is working towards that goal. Why is that? Because our most intense desire is manifest at the time of our death. This is why they have Make-A-Wish foundations, because the desire that people have at the end of their life is the culmination of all their desires during their life. And so why Krishna focuses at the going to be the determining factor as to what we deserve, where we should go. And so if our Make-A-Wish is to attain Krishna, then Krishna will give that. And Krishna will make sure, if we led the right life, led the good life, that he will enter into our mind at the time of death so that we can remember him. Even if we are unable to remember him, Krishna will purposefully, Krishna will forcefully enter into our mind. So I see a few questions here. We can answer them. If you put something in the chat box, I don't see it because I'm looking at the slides and speaking, so I cannot read the chats simultaneously. So just raise your hand or ask your question, because the chat box we can use at the end when we're doing question answer, but I cannot see.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Dandavat Pranam. Prabhu, what do you mean by exactly when Krishna is saying, at once attains my nature? What does this exactly mean?
Yes. So that is a good question. That simply means that Krishna's nature is spiritual. Krishna's nature is godly. So we also become godly. That means that Just like Krishna is godly, we also become godly. The
Okay, thank you,
spiritual,
Prabhu.
we attain the spiritual nature, which is the spiritual world.
Sure, Prabhu. Thank you so much.
Prabhuji, regarding this question, we become godly once we attained him. But is it not when we are practicing Krishna consciousness, those qualities come into a pure devotee already before attaining him?
Yes, this is why it said the devotee is Jivan Mukta. He's liberated even while living because he attains Krishna's nature. He attains Krishna's spiritual nature. So actually, it's a fact that the devotee does not have to wait until death to become liberated. He is Jivan Mukta. He's already liberated. But for most of us, we attain the Lord's nature after death because to become Jivan Mukta is very difficult. But if we practice Krishna consciousness very sincerely throughout our life, then in our next life, Krishna will award us his spiritual nature. But it's a matter of degree. It's not all black and white. We may become godly to some degree. So we may start to imbibe Krishna's nature, and then we will attain Krishna's spiritual nature.
Prabhu,
Thank you,
are we
Prabhuji.
talking? Sorry, Prabhu. Are we talking about like Krishna has 64 qualities? So are we talking about that we also get those qualities? Not maybe like not that we are becoming Krishna, but we absorb those qualities.
Yes, some of those qualities for sure. Something like 50 qualities. So the pure devotee of the Lord gets all those qualities. But that's a very minor thing. The main thing is that we become Shuddha Sattva, pure goodness, that same nature as the Lord, that spiritual Brahman-like nature becomes our nature. Yes. Anjali Mataji?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Prabhuji, I just want to connect this with the verse 4.9, Janma Karma Cha Me Divyam. I always had this doubt that can it be that easy? That words, from what I understand, is that it says theoretically also, if we can understand that Krishna is transcendental above the modes of material nature, that we are liberated. And this verse also is somewhat saying that if we can understand Krishna's nature, that is transcendental, and then we attain to that nature. Am I making it too simple, or is it that is what these two verses are saying?
Well, this verse is quite difficult. I mean, this verse is saying if you remember Krishna at the end of your life, you attain Krishna's nature. Now, that is quite difficult. Let's say if someone is in a car accident or something, how likely is it that they will remember Krishna? But therefore, that's why I was saying that how service to Krishna is so important, and we will discuss this more. But Prabhupada says that how if we serve Krishna throughout our life, then even if we don't remember him at the time of death, we don't remember him, Krishna will force us to remember him at the time of death. And so that's why it's not so easy, because we have to serve Krishna to earn that, so that Krishna will force himself in our mind. Or we may be fortunate, and at the time of our death, we may remember Krishna due to our spiritual practice. Now, that verse that you're saying, Janma Karma Cha Me Divyam, that verse is saying that yes, one who knows my nature, the appearance and qualities, that person attains me. But knowing Krishna's nature is not easy. To know Krishna's nature is very, very difficult. The pure devotees of the Lord know Krishna's nature. We may read about Krishna's nature, but that doesn't mean that we know it. So even to know Krishna's nature very deeply is not easy.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji.
Thank you. Shulba Mataji? You're still muted.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you so much. As always, really a wonderful lecture. Thank you. So, are you able to hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure. I have two questions. First question is, remember the Bhishma hold his death, like he was in the Banshaya for a long time, and he waited for the right time to, leave the body. So there is a thing, right? You have to leave the body in the certain murata, certain time. Yogi can do it. So how can we do that? We don't know anything, right? So if we leave body in certain time, then definitely we'll go back to the life cycle, and we have to come back. So like, if you can guide me
Yes.
on that. And I have another question.
Yeah, so I'll just do this one first, and then so Krishna actually, Prabhupada actually mentions on this point that for the devotee, these things happen automatically. The devotee does not have to worry about the time that they leave their body or when they leave their body or how to control the breath so that the soul goes upward. Uh, Devotees do sometimes take care of these things, like in the case of Bhishma Dev, right? Bhishma Dev, he waited for the right time to leave his body. And he waited like 6 months, even though the battle of Kurukshetra was finished in 18 days. So the devotees are oftentimes very accomplished yogis themselves. But ultimately, Bhishma Dev obviously didn't go back to Godhead because he left his body at the right time. He went back to Godhead because at the final moment he was seeing Krishna face to face, standing in front of him. And if you see Krishna face to face standing in front of you, every time is the best time to leave. So this is like we were discussing before, Krishna speaks in the Gita on many different levels for many different people. So for the mystic yogi, one who is not a bhakta, for them this is very important. Oh, let me practice this so that I can leave the body at the right time. But for the devotee, that's not the main message of this chapter. The main message is one of the verses that are focusing that Krishna is saying, that become my devotee and think of me always, remember me always. So yes.
Thank you so much. Can I go and ask another
Yes.
question?
Go ahead.
Yes. So in verse 13, it says, Om is non and Krishna. So can you elaborate on that, please?
So I actually haven't come on those slides, so we will come to that. Yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Gopal Govinda Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, very nice class. Please accept my humble obeisances. Question and recollection from the previous class, like 4.7 and 8.5, where we are receiving the promises from Krishna. But you also mentioned that devotee, even though these promises are there, these are just to strengthen our belief and faith, but we should not be complacent, because Prabhupada was all the time praying to Krishna that Maya is very strong and can take away any time. And we hear from our spiritual masters that Maya is so strong, no matter what level of achievements you might have done, at the last minute, Maya can pull you out. So just want to hear from you how one the neophytes like us should take it. I mean, like there's a
And
promise,
so,
which is hope, and there's a risk.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. No. So I'm also neophyte. So we're just going to try to um, uh, do this together. The thing is that actually Krishna and Prabhupada, they tell us that Krishna consciousness is very simple for the simple. It's actually very easy, and we can become a nice devotee of the Lord. But really, these two things that you're mentioning are one and the same thing, because we will only be able to fulfill those promises, or be able to qualify for those promises, like you're saying, if we are constantly striving to be a devotee. To give you an example, just like Prabhupada's example of if you chant 16 rounds and follow the 4 regulated principles every day, you can go back to Godhead. And that's his promise. And so I think your question is, we should not be complacent just by doing those things. Well, And I've seen in my own life that just to do that is very difficult. It's easy for 6 months, it's easy for a year, but to do that when life gets very bad or very difficult is not easy. And so, in saying something simple, Prabhupada is actually asking for something very difficult. That even when times are very difficult, will we be able to chant 16 rounds and follow the four regulative principles? Even in the presence of temptation, will we be able to follow the four regulative principles? Even in the times of great distress, like our house burning down, will we be able to chant the Lord's holy names? So those things are not so easy. And the only way we will be successful if we have cultivated our life of devotion. Unless we have that life of devotion, that deep, firm affection and faith in the Lord, then when things get difficult, we will not be able to stick to our Krishna consciousness. And there's one devotee in this movement, Mother Vishaka, and she mentioned how since the time of her initiation, she chanted her rounds every single day, never missed a day. How many of us can say that? But she said, except for one day, and it was the day when her house burned down. And it actually happened. Her house burned down. And she said, I couldn't chant on that day because the whole house was burning down and I had to pull things out and do things. But then the next day, I made up my rounds. And Srila Prabhupada actually said that that's okay. Prabhupada said that if one day you, for some emergency, you cannot chant, then we're not fanatics. Prabhupada said you can make it up the next day. So this is leading the life of devotion. And I cannot say that. I cannot say that I haven't missed 16 rounds since the time of my initiation. But there are some devotees like this who are like that. And so we are constantly striving to come to that platform. Dhananjay Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranam, Jai Srila Prabhupada. This is Jai Draupadi Devi Dasi. Wonderful, wonderful. Yesterday we were reading this chapter with Gopal Govind Prabhu, and it's really nice. I have a question, two questions. One question: how can we see think like the person who is about to leave? How can we think he's remembering Krishna at the time?
How can we know if they remember?
Yeah. How can we know? Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's fine. So yes, there are actually various signs that show us whether or not someone goes back to Godhead. And those signs are mentioned in the scriptures. Something happened really weird to the screen. So those signs are mentioned, and the great devotees, they can understand. They can understand if someone left like in that way. For example, one of the signs is all of a sudden, out of nowhere, where the body's being cremated, a cow will come. A cow will just, happen to walk into that area. Now, in the Western world, that sign will probably not manifest, right? But in India, traditionally, they would burn the body at the ghat, at the bank of the river. And it's an open place. And this is actually a fact. For one devotee, I know that this is the case. Just out of nowhere, a cow just happened to come and stroll by while the body was being cremated. Another sign is that a devotee of the Lord will just appear on the scene at that time. And appear on the scene meaning they will visit unexpectedly. Someone has died, but a devotee will come, or a devotee is present. Another sign is the time and the way in which the devotee passes away. Do they pass away in a very, wonderful, you could say, in sometimes Brahma Muhurta time, or they're, near their deities, or there's devotees around them. So many signs can suggest it. But yes, ultimately only Krishna knows who goes where. And even when it was crystal clear, well, not crystal clear, but even when it was so clear, Prabhupada would say that Krishna willing, this person has gone back to Godhead. So that decision is only known by Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Almost you gave the answer of my second question also. So yeah, thank you. And it happened recently. Actually, last year my father-in-law passed away, and he was not a like very Krishna conscious, but whatever science you said, it happened. So hopefully I will pray to Krishna, like keep him in his shelter.
Yes. Wow. See, that is most likely if he himself was not so Krishna conscious, yet those signs came, then that is most likely because all of you are Krishna conscious. Because that's the other thing, is that Krishna says that if there's a devotee in the household, then 26 generations of that devotee become liberated. Prabhupada says 9 in the future, 21 generations, 7 of the past, 7 of the present, and 7 of the future. So the best gift that we can give to our parents and to our relatives is to be good devotees ourselves, because they may go back home, back to Godhead, because of their dependents or their family members' Krishna consciousness. And this is a fact. This is very true. Yeah, it's completely true. I've seen it so many times that someone who wasn't even a very serious devotee goes back home, back to Godhead, because they have a devotee in their family. So, so yes.
Prabhuji, can you please explain more? Prabhuji, can you please explain the 7 in the present? What does that mean, 7 generations? And also, in some lecture, some devotee was saying that they get liberated means that they get a chance to follow the process of bhakti. They also have to willingly take to the process, like they get a chance to be born in a good family or
Yes.
get connected.
Yes. So they get liberated in the sense that they're now destined to go back to Godhead. But like a Jamil, they may come back and get another chance to develop their bhakti to that point. But causeless mercy is also there. Krishna can make someone a devotee just by, like Lord Chaitanya, he would embrace someone and that person would be filled with ecstatic love. So Krishna is not limited by anything. He makes a promise that for my devotee, he tells Prahlad Maharaj, 21 generations are liberated. So Krishna will fulfill that promise. The question is whether or not we are devotees or not. And so Krishna, does he have that promise to fulfill? But if we are devotees, if someone is a devotee, then Krishna will fulfill that promise and will liberate that person. That may be by giving them one more life as a devotee, or it just may be by embracing them and giving them pure bhakti. 7 in the present means your immediate family members. So like, we have brothers, sisters, kind of this is horizontally. So 7 in the present, 7 in the past, and 7 in the future. Now, this is just the minimum, but it's said that if someone is a Paramahansa devotee, if someone is a sannyasi, then Krishna liberates 100 generations. Not 21 generations, but 100 generations. And actually, I can tell you a small experience on this very quickly because we don't have so much time. But one time I was traveling with my Guru Maharaj, Gopal Krishna Goswami Maharaj, and in his family, to my knowledge, he's the only one who became a devotee, like an actual like ISKCON devotee like that. And so one time he was in some city, I think Jaipur, and he was visiting his family members there, who were very elderly. This was maybe 10 years ago or something, very elderly. And they were like, 10 relatives, sort of distant relative, not so distant, but not immediate family members, like relative type family members. And it was amazing. These people, like, they were not chanting all these things, but it was amazing when he was speaking to them that how every difficulty that you can imagine in the material world had these family members had faced virtually every difficulty. They were telling Maharaj their story and how this happened. Like you would just think like the whole like material world was everything around them was crumbling, and they were so devotional in nature, and at that point I could understand that Krishna was really showing his mercy to them. like like materially they couldn't be successful, and so Krishna was just like in that life pushing them towards spiritual life in every way that he could, and almost you could say forcing them to become devotees because they were destined to be devotees, right? So even in the present life, Krishna can arrange it in such a way that that person starts to call out to Krishna, and then they all offer their obeisances to him. Many of them were much older than he was. They all were begging for his blessings. They were like so happy to have a pure devotee in their family, and just Krishna conscious, but not Krishna conscious in the external sense. They had not taken up the process of chanting 16 rounds and all these things. Maybe they would eventually, but they were thinking of Krishna day and night because their life just Krishna forced it in such a way. Same thing with Indradumna Maharaj, his story about his mother. That just like a year before she passed away, she started to think of Krishna all the time. So in these devotees' families, something very mystical happens. And you'll see that their family members, Radhanath Maharaj's parents, right? So many times we've seen them in videos and things like that. They become devotees, and they get a special grace where they become devotees within their heart. And even though they don't take up the standard process of bhakti, they get that causeless mercy, the causeless mercy that Prabhupada talks about. That mercy is causeless because it's going to a devotee's family member, and they are kripa siddhas. They're not sadhana siddhas, but they're kripa siddhas. Brandy, yes.
Thank you. Okay. I had a different question to begin with, but I really want to go off of these points because I was also just talking about this in class. And so with these generations, does this mean just from this current life, or does this mean from our past lives as well? So like families that we've had in past lives. And then I have also another question with it, but you can answer that.
That's very interesting. And I really don't know the authorized answer to that question, because many times like great devotees, they become great devotees over the course of a few lifetimes.
Yeah.
And what about their previous lifetimes? Like the 21 that I understood is 7 of your previous generations in this life. So like, for example, father, grandfather, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-grandfather, like that 7 generations. In previous lives, I don't know, if they should get some benefit as well because they participate in that devotee liberation. So I think Krishna works it all out. The point is, the general point that he's making is that the family members of a devotee are also very fortunate. And this is why once a person becomes an unalloyed devotee of Krishna, they actually don't have an obligation towards their family because they are fulfilling that obligation by becoming a devotee. So they are not, it's not that they don't have obligation, they have obligation, but they're very deep a devotee who fills that obligation. But we also need to remember that that is the case for pure devotees. So until we are pure devotees, we still on the mature level are obliged to our, to our parents and, family members, children, because like a pure devotee doesn't have to take care of his elderly parents. Pure devotee can just take sannyas and serve the Lord. There's no obligation. On the other hand, devotees do. Why? Because they have no reason not to, and secondly, also they don't feel that they're at that level of unavoided spiritual devotion.
Okay, thank you. I asked because I understand that it's a culmination over lifetimes, as you said, to get to this point. And so obviously there's so many different souls that have helped us get to where we are. But the question that's like, I just don't understand. For the future generations or even present and past too, if they've already passed away, if a member has already passed away, so like my brother who passed away, how does it, like if they're already moved on to different lives, how does that work? Like, I'm sure he doesn't just like, pick them out, and I don't,
wherever they are,
I can't be certain of anything, but
no, wherever they are, Krishna will liberate them.
wow.
So like your brother mentioned, if they moved on somewhere else and they're in a different life, but he was your brother, and if you become a pure devotee, Krishna will liberate them. Because the point here is that like in the case of Dhruva Maharaj felt obliged to his mother, because his mother, well, especially because she gave spiritual knowledge, but even aside from that, his mother nourished him as a child. His father nourished him. His brothers and sisters gave him their friendship. So the devotee, you could say, is connected with these people. And because the devotee is dear to the Lord, Krishna liberates those people as well. Because the devotee, since the devotee feels obliged, he feels like, I have a debt to this person, and so they should go back to God before I should go. And because Krishna wants to bring the devotee back to the spiritual world, the devotee says, no, they should go before I should go, and so he has to take them also. So that is, and then we see in the case of Vasudeva Datta that he felt obliged to the whole world. He felt compassionate to the whole world. And so therefore the Lord has to liberate the whole world just to satisfy Vasudeva Datta. So in some ways, the family is actually just a very small part. Anyone who the devotee wants to be liberated will get liberated, because it's actually the devotee who gives their mercy, and it's through their causeless mercy that the people become devotees. So it is actually the devotee who liberates everyone, and so we just somehow or the other have to become dear to the devotee. Like the famous story in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, that a dog was dear to Shivananda Sen, and Shivananda Sen was a pure devotee of the Lord. And because that dog was so dear to him, somehow or the other, he was part of the parikrama party. And so Shivananda Sen treated him like a member of the party. He said, this dog is coming with us on this pilgrimage, and so he's a member. And so he became very dear to Shivananda Sen, dear in the sense not attached. Shivananda Sen was just taking care of him as he was taking care of all the devotees. And so when the dog died, Lord Chaitanya had to liberate him. And Lord Chaitanya specifically tells at that time that dog gains liberation because it was being taken care of by Shivananda Sen. So Prabhupada says there, he says there's a great message in this story. He says that if we become the dog of a pure devotee, if somehow or the other we become dear to a devotee, then they'll think of us, and that will become our pathway to the spiritual world.
Okay, thank you. You answered more of my questions too. And I've heard that the devotees are actually more merciful than Krishna.
Of course,
So
yes.
that makes sense. And Krishna, we can't get to know Krishna without knowing his devotees. So thank you, Hare Krishna.
Thank you. Yes, like Vasudeva Datta, he liberated the whole world just by his desire to Lord Chaitanya. Unfortunately, we were not on the planet apparently at that time. That's why we didn't get liberation. Because when we say that Vasudeva Datta liberated the whole world, so then what happened to the material world? Prabhupada says that then it filled up again. So it is actually true. He says that this is not fantasy. He actually did liberate the whole universe, but then it filled up again. And so, yeah, we were somewhere else at that time. So, Rupal Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Danvat Pranam. This is Rupal. Prabhuji, you partially answered the question from previous question, but my question is that we always, based on my neophyte knowledge, I understand that liberation and all this happens when the son is a devotee. What about if daughter is a devotee or trying to follow the path? And what happens to, for example, what happens to my parents or my side of family?
Mm, very nice question. That is actually this idea of the sun giving liberation. That is actually true, but that is a ritualistic statement. In other words, like in India, everyone wants to have a son
Right.
because then they can go to Swarg. They can go to the heavens. The son will do the pindan, and then once they do the pindan, then they'll feed food to the forefathers, and from that we'll get to have a good time in the heavenly planets. And so therefore people want a son. But in the context of devotional service and bhakti, that principle is simply not true. And it's not true at all. If the girl is a pure devotee of the Lord, then she will also liberate 21 generations or 100 generations or whatnot based upon the level of her advancement. And this is the issue of the son is because in order to do the ritualistic ceremonies, it has to be the man, and it's kind of that's where that relationship is. But in terms of the devotees liberating his family members, that has to do with the desire of the devotee. You see, like Dhruva Maharaj, when he was on the plane, he told Krishna, I won't go without my mother, he thought. And then Krishna then tells him, Lord Vishnu tells him, oh, she's already there. So the same thing is that Prahlad Maharaj also was asking for his father. So Krishna fulfills the desires of his devotees. So if the girl is a devotee, then why won't he fulfill her desire? If the gopis desired something, then wouldn't Krishna fulfill it? If Mother Yashoda desired something, wouldn't he fulfill it? So the same thing, if there's a girl who's a devotee, then the Krishna will fulfill whatever desires the devotee has. These statements are just to encourage us and just to focus us. Okay, yeah, my parents might not be devotees, but I have to become a devotee. But the general principle is that this is actually a very small thing. Whatever the devotee desires, Krishna fulfills.
Okay, thank you very much, Prabhuji, for answering.
Thank
Hari
you.
Bol.
Hare Krishna. Thank you. Okay, so wonderful discussion. Very nice questions. This is actually the main heart of this that we talked about. So we already talked about this, how whatever our consciousness is in this life, that forms our next life. And it's very important to know that this is true of the devotee and this is true of everyone. This is why right now we're actually forming our next life. And here are some examples of this. Bharat Maharaj, he was almost a prema bhakta, but he got attached to a deer, so he became a deer. So different devotees attain different stages based upon how they leave this world. So we have to remember Krishna. Smaranam is very important, always remembering him. And the way we remember Krishna is by chanting the holy name of Krishna. That is the key. This is why chanting is important, because we then remember Krishna, and Krishna is saying, one who remembers me at the time of death reaches me. Throughout one's life, one should practice remembering Krishna, and then one will attain the supreme abode for sure. And therefore, this chapter has this very famous verse. It has a very, very important verse that is quoted very often by Srila Prabhupada, 8.7, in which Krishna says, Mam anusmara yudhyacha. He tells, therefore, Arjuna that remembering me is not an end-of-life activity. How on the battlefield can you die thinking of me? You can die thinking of me when you fight thinking of me. So he says, Yudhyacha, Yudhya means fighting, Anusmara. So you think of me, Mam, while you fight. Because Arjuna is like, I can't be a sage. How can I do it when there's so many arrows coming at me? Well, think of me while you fight. And fighting can also be taken metaphorically, that while we are fighting in this world, we have to think of Krishna. And then whenever death comes, we'll be ready. And how can we think of Krishna throughout our day and at the time of death? By continuously chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So we may be doing so many devotional service, but if we are not chanting, we will not be able to think of Krishna. And that's why every aspect of our devotional service should be accompanied by the chanting of the holy name of Krishna. Because it is Yuga Dharma, whatever we do, we should, cooking, cleaning, we should always be chanting along with it. Because if we're doing things for Krishna, then we are doing Yudhyacha. We are fighting for Krishna, right? So that part is there. If we're cooking, then we are Yudhyacha. We are fighting for Krishna by cooking for Krishna, by cooking for the army, right? Saying this metaphorically again. But then we are not doing anusmara. We're not thinking of Krishna. The thinking part comes when we chant. So we should always accompany our service with some form of chanting if possible. And as I said, Prabhupada repeats this mantra 6 times in this chapter. 6 times. And you might think, well, okay, that's not so much, only 6 times. But if you compare it with the other chapters, only in this chapter does Krishna, just Prabhupada mentioned it so many times. In some chapters, he doesn't even mention the mantra once. All other chapters, 0. In chapter 4, he mentions it once, chapter 6, once, chapter 7, once, chapter 8, 6 times, chapter 9, 3 times, 10, 3, like this. So we can see the importance of this in relation to a death. So particularly if we are about to die, the only instruction is just chant continuously. So as we get older, we can increase our chanting, the number of rounds that we do. I know many devotees who are in Vanaprastha who are chanting 64 rounds every day. And for them, they're not doing this artificially or out of their ego. They're doing this because that's their stage in life. They're getting closer to death. For those of us who are younger, or are in good health and like that, our main service may be doing more active practical service to push on the movement. And that goes on, even devotees who are very elderly, who are constantly absorbed in preaching, they can only chant 16 rounds. But the point being that when one knows that their time is very close, they can increase that number of rounds. One's memory of Krishna is revived by chanting the Mahamantra, Hare Krishna. Prabhupada says, by this practice of chanting and hearing the sound vibration of the Supreme Lord, one's ear, tongue, and mind are engaged. This mystic meditation is very easy to practice. By chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, one fixes his mind always on the Supreme Lord. The mind is fickle, and therefore it is necessary to engage the mind by force to think of Krishna. So Prabhupada here says by force. We have to really push ourselves to think of Krishna. And when I'm chanting my rounds, I have to do that. I think about that because my mind wants to go everywhere else except for the chanting, like everywhere else. And so one really has to force oneself to think of Krishna. And one can do that very nicely by looking at pictures of Krishna, thinking of Krishna. So now in these next few verses, Krishna tells us, well, if we have to think of Krishna all the time, if we have to meditate on him, then how do we meditate upon him? He's helping us. So Prabhupada is saying we have to force ourselves to think of Krishna. Well, here Krishna is telling us these are ways in which you can hook the mind on Krishna. This is how you can force yourself or find avenues of focusing on him. One should meditate upon the Supreme Person as, and in this verse he gives us some very key ways. The one who knows everything. So Krishna is the one who knows everything. So we can meditate upon him as the wisest person, as the oldest person. No one is older than Krishna. No one is more experienced than Krishna. As the controller, Krishna is the controller of everything. Who is smaller than the smallest? Krishna is the most minute. Who is the maintainer of everything? Krishna maintains everything. Who is beyond all material conception? He is beyond our limited sense perception. Who is inconceivable. So we can meditate on him as someone who is beyond our meditation. Who is always a person. So he has all of these qualities, yet Krishna is a person. He is luminous like the sun. Krishna is giving so many wonderful ways in this chapter to remember him. He is luminous like the sun. This is Parusharam. The Lord's form is Parusharam. He is transcendental beyond this material nature. As you can see, this is already turning into meditation. Right? He is transcendental. Krishna is beyond this whole material sphere. How wonderful he is. To facilitate this meditation, one should practice fixing the prana in the topmost chakra, should renounce all sense gratification, especially sex life, and should chant Om to remember the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So now Krishna is saying that he's setting the yoga practice also along with the bhakti practice on how one can focus the mind on Krishna. And I mentioned to you before how yoga practice does help in the process. One can practice, half an hour of yoga a day and in fixing the prana or the mind on Krishna, but it is not necessary. It is not required for the devotee. So, in terms of the practice of celibacy, in previous times, again, this was more possible. They were all saints and sages, and they would go to the forest to become great mendicants. But Prabhupada himself, very interestingly, in the purport to this verse, 8:11, says that in this day and age, it's not possible to be a Naishtika Brahmachari, or it is extremely difficult. And therefore, the only process that allows householders to become self-realized is the process of Bhakti Yoga. This is why the other processes of Dhyana and Jnana and Ashtanga Yoga are all rejected, because they are actually only possible for those who are celibate monks, who have decided to lead that life. And even these yoga processes will say that only those who are full-time can do this. Household life and householders are only eligible for the process of bhakti. So Prabhupada here says, therefore he gives a solution: unless one practices celibacy, advancement in spiritual life is very difficult. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya has announced, according to the scriptural injunctions for this age of Kali, that in this age, no process of realizing the Supreme is possible except the chanting of the holy names of Krishna. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So everything is messed up in this day and age. Everything is going against us, and therefore the only process is the chanting of the Mahamantra, which Srila Prabhupada again repeats in this purport. Closing all the doors of the senses and fixing the mind on the heart and the life air at the top of the head. One has to focus his mind on Krishna. Krishna's saying here in this next verse in 8:12, this is the yoga practice. He describes these chakras and how the yogi releases the soul from the top, not from the mouth or not from the anus, but through the head. When the soul leaves through the head, then we know that that person has reached the Lord. Speaking of signs, actually, someone asked the question, what are the signs if someone has gone back home, back to Godhead? Another sign is that you'll see that most people, when they die with their mouth open. Because if the soul leaves from the mouth open, it leaves in the mode of passion. If it leaves from the anus, it leaves from in the mode of ignorance. And when it leaves from the skull, it leaves in the mode of goodness. So devotees, you'll see, I mean, again, these are just suggestions. It's not black and white, but you'll see that their mouth remains closed and they leave in deep meditation and it pops through their head. I remember still seeing the body of Tamal Krishna Maharaj after he passed away in Mayapur. I happened to be there, and this was many, many years ago. And he left his body in Mayapur, and so they brought his body. And his body was so effulgent. And this was India. They hadn't put any chemicals in his body to make it look really beautiful like they do in the West, or even in India, in the cities. But this was Mayapur, a very simple town. And so there was no chemicals put in his body, but his body was so effulgent. To this day, I remember. And his mouth and face was completely closed, like in like intense meditation, as though someone would be really meditating. And you could see that the soul left from the head. Vibrating the sacred Om, syllable Om, thinking of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the devotee leaves his body. Now, I think, Sulba Mataji, you asked the question about the relationship between Hare Krishna and Om. So I just wanted to talk about that really briefly. So Prabhupada explains that Om and Hare Krishna are the same thing. Om and Krishna and Vishnu and Brahman, they're all the same thing. However, Om refers to the impersonal aspect of God. Om, right? Krishna as Om, the impersonal form. And Krishna, Hare Krishna, refers to the personal form of the Lord. And therefore, although Om and Hare Krishna are the same thing, chanting Hare Krishna is better because it refers to the personal form of the Lord. And that is what we need. We need to meditate on the form of the Lord. So here in this purport from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Srila Prabhupada explains this further. He says, Omkar is a combination of the letters A-U-M, Om. The letter A-U-M refers to Krishna, who is Sarva Lokaika Nayaka, the master of all living entities and planets, material and spiritual. The letter U, Ukara, indicates Srimati Radharani, this pleasure potency of Krishna. And indicates the living entities, the jivas. Thus, Om is the complete combination of Krishna, his potency, and his eternal servitors. In other words, Omkara represents Krishna, his name, fame, pastimes, entourage, expansions, devotees, potencies, and everything else pertaining to him. Now, this seems to contradict what I just said. But no, when the pure devotee chants Om, when they chant Omkara, then they see the form of the Lord in Om. Like it's being described so nice here, A refers to Krishna, to Srimati Radharani. Srimati Radharani, and the jivas. But Om by itself, simply when chanted by the non-devotee, is an indirect referral to Krishna. So the word sun, for example, the word sun, S-O-N, sun, can refer to anyone. It refers to sun, just any sun. But when my mother says sun, then she's referring to me, right? Then that sun has a very specific meaning, and she thinks of someone when she says that word, or she's thinking of my elder brother. So the same thing is with the devotee, that Om is like sun. It's not a direct name. It's not like my name, Gopal. So it's like a generic, form of address to God. But now when the devotee says it, he thinks of Krishna. And Krishna, Shrimati Radharani, the jivas, this is what they think of. Because they're referring to someone very specific. When the materialist says Om, they just think of God, Brahman, impersonal. But if someone says Krishna, then they are referring only to Krishna. So when the pure devotee says Krishna, they're thinking of Shyamasundar Krishna. When the materialist is saying Krishna, then they are also thinking of Krishna because that refers to Krishna. And that's why the chanting of Krishna is safer than the chanting of Om. And this is why we do 16 rounds of Hare Krishna Mahamantra and not Om, because we're not pure devotees. Most of us are not. And so that's why when we chant Om, we may or may not think of Krishna, but we will think of Krishna only when we say Krishna. So as a final point, I'm going to end here. Although this yoga practice is genuine, it is easier and more effective to remember the Lord through unalloyed devotion, unalloyed love and devotion. Such bhakti yogis achieve Krishna directly and never fall down, from the highest Vaikuntha planet. So Krishna has described the yoga practice again here, but from here onwards, he will talk about bhakti. There's a little bit more to this chapter, but most of it is very straightforward. And so that's why I'm stopping here. I just want to leave a few minutes more for questions because it so happens that today I have to end at the hour, at the end of this hour. So that's why I'm just ending a little early.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much for a wonderful explanation. Actually, all these years, I always had a question for Om and Hare Krishna, but actually could never understand Om. I read a couple of times Om, but I couldn't understand. But you clarified such a big topic for me, and the way you compared is such a big help. So I'm very thankful to you, Prabhu. And I have this doubt, the Brahman, in the beginning, we said that Brahman is we, like the self entity. I am a little confused there because my understanding always is Brahman is the Brahma Jyoti. So I want that question. And second question, like you mentioned, the celibate, the brahmacharis, they perform the other yogas and ashtanga and everything.
Yes.
And I know last time you mentioned one thing that unsuccessful brahmacharis enter in the household life.
Yes.
So I always wonder, should our mentality is that brahmacharis are very higher advanced stage of bhakti because they have completely devoted their life to Krishna and they are not having that or we do not judge in the sense, automatically sometime when we see brahmacharis we have like, oh, they are very high, but does that mean that householders becomes little one step down? I'm not trying to judge, but I'm trying to clear my understanding. So these two questions I have, Brahman and brahmachari.
Yes, very nice question. So the answer for the first one is that in Sanskrit, the literal translation of Brahman is spirit. So you have, matter and spirit, right? So Brahman refers to spirit. So Krishna is Brahman because he is all spirit. And we are part and parcel of Krishna. So ultimately, Brahman refers to Krishna, or like you're saying, the Brahma Jyoti. But we are part and parcel of Krishna. We are also spirit. And so therefore, Brahman also refers to us, the spirit soul. It doesn't just refer to God. Very important point there. So Brahman is used in so many different ways in the scriptures, and very often it is used in relation to the soul, or it's used in relation to Brahma Jyoti, like you said, or it's used in relation to Krishna. Krishna is what? Krishna is Para Brahman. He is the highest Brahman. We are also Brahman, but he is Para Brahman. Yeah, so that's the difference. Now, regarding which is the same quality, right? Same quality, Brahman. So now, regarding the second question about the brahmacharis, so that I was referring to in terms of who enters into grahastha life. So the unsuccessful brahmachari. So, at the end of the class, there's some students who get A's, some who get B's, some who get C's. So I was actually just reading this again. Prabhupada was saying, I forget where I was reading. He was confirming this thing, which we were talking about. That he said that those brahmacharis who did not understand the teachings of their guru, those brahmacharis who still retained a mode of sense enjoyment and attachment to this world, they become householders. That is, those after so much instruction, they still didn't get it in their head that this material world is temporary. It's no good. They enter household life, and they will go through that process and then move forward. But that does not mean that the current grahastha, meaning the grahastha who's been a grahastha for 10, 20 years, or even one day, it doesn't mean that the current grahastha is less advanced than the brahmachari. Because a grahastha can also be a brahmachari and can also be a pure devotee. Shivananda Sen was a grahastha. He was an associate of the Lord. Most of the associates of Lord Chaitanya were grahasthas. Almost all of them, actually. The intimate associates of the Lord. So one can be a pure devotee and be a grahastha. Because the grahastha life itself teaches us, it allows us to transcend these desires. By going through it, we transcend it. We're no longer attracted to it. And in some ways, a grahastha becomes then even more safe than a brahmachari. The Bhagavad mentions this, that a grahastha can traverse the world anywhere, free from fear, because he's already married and he already has a wife and he's already seen how boring and how limited material pleasure is. So yes, the story of Ramanujacharya's disciple, Dhanurdas, is a very good example of this. So therefore, the current grahasthas, they are not necessarily less advanced than the brahmacharis. But those who enter, yes, they were unsuccessful, unless they were instructed by the Lord or the devotee to enter grahastha life. There's a few rare examples of this also, where someone is, for example, the son of a king, and they go to Gurukul and they become a pure devotee, and they're like, I'm going to just stay in the forest. Sorry, Dad, I'm not coming back to lead the kingdom. But then Lord Brahma or some great sage comes to them and says, no, this is your duty. You get married and you lead the kingdom. But that's a very rare case. And it's a fact that even though necessarily speaking, the grahastha can be more advanced, but the grahasthas do give more respect to the brahmacharis and the sannyasis because it's deserved. They have chosen a more difficult life. Family life is difficult, but it's still, why did we choose it? It's still easier than being single. And maybe we didn't realize it at that time that it's actually harder, but still we chose the easy route. We chose the route of less sacrifice, generally speaking. And so brahmacharis and sannyasis are given more respect. They should be given more respect because their level of dedication is, again, generally speaking, exceptions put aside, it is a lot. So we just have a few minutes. Someone who hasn't asked a question can ask a question. I think Kapil Prabhu, maybe you haven't asked.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, thank you so much. Prabhu, my question is from the purport of the first verse. Prabhupada mentions that according to the Vedic dictionary, the Atma refers to mind, soul, body, and senses. So, Prabhu, can you help us understand the mind and the senses aspect of Atma?
Yes. Because again, this is the thing of Sanskrit. Atma, in the literal way, just means self. So Atma actually means also spirit, but another meaning of the word is self. And so Atma can sometimes refer to the soul. It can also refer to the body, because sometimes, like you say, oh, your hand is hurting. So you're referring to the person as the hand, their body, your hand, or So depending on the context in the scriptures, Sometimes Atma can also refer to the body or the senses, but sometimes we say that we're the mind. And to some degree, like in other words, in a conventional sense, we are our mind, right? When this guy is crazy, we say this guy is crazy. Well, it's his mind that's crazy. It's not him that's crazy. But we still say he's crazy when his mind is crazy because the mind is part of the self. So many translators don't know this point that Srila Prabhupada is making. And that's why when they translate the Gita, it's like such a funny translation. Their translations will be like, know the self, by the self, through the self, in the self. And you read it, it's like, this Gita doesn't make sense. But Prabhupada, he knows where to translate it, how. And so he says, remembering that within the body, there's a soul. And in this verse, it will be just Atma twice. So it's actually a very important point. And Prabhupada translates it in that way. So I'm going to share a slide. Someone requested sharing the slide on the Om.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Very much. Yes. Okay. Here we go. This one. Yes. Okay. So you can see here's the slide on Om. Write it down if you like. Yes, that was a very nice question. The Atma can refer to many different things. Okay, so I think this is a very good time. We've covered the main points of this chapter, and please take the time to read and meditate on this chapter during the week. Please memorize your verses. There's at least 1 or 2 verses from this chapter to memorize, and I will share the homework as soon as possible. Sometimes it takes me till Monday or Tuesday, but you have 2 weeks to do it. So please bear with me, and please continue doing the homework. Don't lose your enthusiasm. I know that I do everything to dampen your enthusiasm, but try to keep it alive. In spite of your very limited and imperfect instructor, please try to keep it alive. And we are moving forward. So you keep doing the homework every week, and then once we're done with the Gita, I'll give you a study guide. You'll have your homeworks also, and then we'll take the exam. And we'll take the exam, we'll send it to the Bhakti Shastri board, and then we'll start on the next book. So thank you, everyone. Talk to you next week, and have a wonderful Krishna conscious week. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna,
Thank you,
Prabhu.
Prabhu.
Krishna Prabhu, thank you very much.
Hare
Dhanavad
Krishna,
Prabhu.
Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.